in the Old Testament from Genesis all the way to the prophets. We just don't pay attention to it when we're reading. But there were ancient Jews who paid very close attention to passages like these. And they realized that something very, very strange is going on. There's one God.
These verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too.
Did Jesus claim to be God? Yes, he did. And I'm sure many of you have some verses going through your heads right now. However, I'm convinced that the primary way Jesus claimed to be God, and that his followers claimed he's God, gets overlooked by most Christians and non-Christians because we've lost touch with first century Jewish culture, and we just tend to not notice things. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a quote from Daniel Boyarin in his book, The Jewish Gospels, the story of Jesus Christ, the story of the Jewish Christ. He says, most, if not all, of the ideas and practices of the Jesus movement of the first century and the beginning of the second century, and even later, can be safely understood as part of the ideas and practices that we understand to be the Judaism of the period. The ideas of Trinity and incarnation, or certainly the germs of those ideas, were already present among Jewish believers well before Jesus came on the scene to incarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. So the ideas were there, paving the way for Jesus, who embodied them. Now, who is Daniel Boyarin to say that Christian ideas like the Trinity and the incarnation were already present in some form in first century Judaism? Is he a Christian apologist? No, he's a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. He's a Talmud scholar. He points out that a lot of the beliefs we now think of as distinctively Christian actually weren't. The earliest Christian church was embedded in first century Jewish culture, but as Christianity spread, it became dominated by Gentile Christians who tended to lose touch with the Jewish framework. And something was happening within Judaism as well. As Jewish orthodoxy was forming in the second century, the rabbis tended to weed out certain ideas that had once been familiar in Judaism, but which had been adopted by Christians. The rabbis wanted to clearly distinguish Judaism from Christianity, and some of the ideas that were present in first century Judaism were soon deemed heretical. So Christians lost touch with the Jewish framework of early Christianity, and Jews abandoned some of the Jewish ideas that became part of Christianity. And the result is that today it's easy for us to miss a few things when we're reading the Bible. Claims that would have been understood by listeners at the time might not be understood by us. Here in my opening statement, I'm going to briefly discuss the forgotten Jewish idea that's most relevant for understanding how Jesus claimed to be God. And then I'll show how this forgotten Jewish idea illuminates various passages in the New Testament. Some of you are familiar with the early Jewish belief in the two powers in heaven. Alan Siegel, a Jewish scholar, drew attention to this in his 1977 book, Two Powers in Heaven. And lots of people, especially Christians, have been interested in the topic ever since. Here's the idea in a nutshell. The Old Testament is very clear that there's one true God. But there are numerous passages in the Old Testament where we see two divine figures. I'll give a few quick examples. There are tons of these. Sometimes God seems to be in two different places doing two different things. A common example is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord appears to Abraham and tells him that he's going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see firsthand how bad the people are. So he goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah. And what happens? Genesis 19:24, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The Lord on earth rained down fire from the Lord out of heaven. This thing reboot every couple minutes. It sounds like there are two lords here. Watch what happens in Zechariah 2. Pay attention or you'll miss it. Come, Zion, escape, you who live in daughter Babylon. For this is what the Lord Almighty says. Who's speaking? The Lord Almighty. And he says, after the glorious one has sent me, the Lord was sent by the glorious one, against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. I will surely raise my hand against them, so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. The Lord Almighty was sent by the Lord Almighty. Next paragraph. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord, Yahweh. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord, Yahweh, will live among them, and they will know that the Lord was sent by the Lord Almighty. So Yahweh rains down fire from Yahweh. Yahweh is sent by Yahweh. Plenty of passages like these. Then we've got a mysterious figure called the angel of the Lord. Whatever you think of when you think about angels, just get rid of that. The angel of the Lord is no ordinary angel, because this angel is somehow the Lord. Angel just means messenger. In Hebrew, it can refer to a human messenger, a spirit messenger, or, in this case, the Lord himself. Look at Judges 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down to talk to Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. Then it switches to, the Lord turned to him. The Lord answered. Then it goes back to the angel of the Lord. Then, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. If you see the Lord in all his glory, you're dead. But if you see the angel of the Lord, who is somehow the Lord, you might survive. One more example of this. Here's Jacob blessing Joseph in Genesis 48. Then he blessed Joseph and said, May the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. He, singular. So the God, and the angel are all referring to the same being. The angel is God, but the angel is the messenger of God. This is all over the place in the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way to the prophets. We just don't pay attention to it when we're reading. But there were ancient Jews who paid very close attention to passages like these. And they realized that something very, very strange is going on. There's one God, but there were two powers, two authorities in heaven. If you put all of the passages together, it seems like there's God you can't be around because his presence would destroy you, and God you can be around somehow. There's God you can't be around and God you can be around. The God you can't be around is distinct from the God you can be around. They interact with each other. One sends the other, and yet they're both God. This was all very, very confusing to first century Jews. If there's one God, why are there two powers in heaven?
David Wood points to the two powers in heaven theory to argue that Jews were already expecting a divine Messiah, but that's misleading. The two powers idea was never mainstream. Scholars like Alan Siegel, whom Wood cites, say it was condemned as heresy by Rabbinic Judaism by the 2nd century. It was mostly found in apocalyptic fringe sects, like those behind the Book of Enoch, not the dominant Pharisaic tradition Jesus grew up in. Also, Wood relies on Hebrew Bible passages that use metaphor and repetition, a known literary device in ancient Hebrew. For example, Genesis 19:24 saying, "The Lord rained fire from the Lord," is a classic example of Hebrew parallelism, not a claim of dual divine beings. This is widely understood by scholars of Semitic literature, such as Michael Heiser, who notes that while some texts may reflect divine plurality, they don't support a Trinitarian view. Even Daniel Boyarin, who's often misused by apologists, does not say Jesus claimed to be God. He explores how early Christian communities reinterpreted Jewish mystical language to elevate Jesus, but that's post hoc theology, not something Jesus clearly taught. Most critically, there is no direct quote in any gospel where Jesus says, "I am God." That absence is striking if he truly meant to reveal himself as divine in a first-century Jewish context that was strictly monotheistic. So the claim that Jesus clearly declared himself divine relies on reinterpretation, anachronistic readings, and later Christian theology, not on solid historical evidence.
I want to begin with a verse from the Old Testament which might become relevant momentarily. And that is, well, a psalm, not in its entirety, but Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a curious psalm because it opens by saying that God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. Elohim. That is definitely the word for gods. This seems to be an indication that God is talking about, or the psalmist is talking about, the so-called divine council, which also shows up in Job, for example. Later in the psalm he says, I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High. The psalmist is referring to beings here who are definitively not Yahweh, but calling them gods, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to make a point out of that. Jesus is going to do that for me as we turn to what I think is the most important Christological gospel of the four, which is, of course, John's gospel. Many people think that I just dismiss John's gospel because it's written too late or something. It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the gospels, but I'm willing to just treat it as if it's historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually says about himself. The question we're interested in here is the relationship that Jesus has to his Father. David has been speaking about the two powers in heaven heresy and saying that Jesus' relationship to the Father is the kind of relationship that the people who believed in these two powers was talking about. Well, let's investigate that in Jesus' own words. There is one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus responds by saying, I and the Father are one. I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except for someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God, that is, identical to Yahweh? Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be called gods, that is, sons of the Most High. So it's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says, believe the works, that is the works of my Father through me, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Another pretty intense Christological claim. What does it mean? Let's turn to the most important Christological chapter in John's Gospel, which is, of course, chapter 17. Jesus is praying, first for his disciples, then for all of his believers. Remember, in John chapter 10 so far, Jesus has made two claims. I and the Father are one, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, addressing the relationship that he has to his Father, which David thinks is the two powers in heaven. What does Jesus say in his own words? John chapter 17, verses 20 onwards. My prayer is not for them alone, the disciples. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that is, all of you, that all of them may be one. Hen, H-E-N, the same Greek word used in John 10. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. This is crucial, this is pivotal. When Jesus is asked to clarify his Christological status, what is his relationship to the Father? He says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. He then later prays that all of us will one day be in God in the same way, just as, kathos in the Greek, which doesn't just mean as, it means in the same way as, just as. If this is supposed to indicate that Jesus is claiming to be identical to Yahweh, what does that make the rest of us? And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too. The same thing is true of another important quote from John's Gospel, which is when Philip asks Jesus to show him the Father. What does Jesus say? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Another intense Christological claim. He then follows up by saying, how can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So again, Jesus clarifies his relationship to the Father, this time saying that he doesn't speak on his own authority. But there's more. In the same chapter this time, chapter 14, just a few verses later, he says to those same disciples who he's just told, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because the Father is in me, and I'm in the Father. He speaks of a future day past his crucifixion and says, on that day, verse 20, on that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. So to recap, Jesus is directly asked to clarify his relationship and his Christology to the Father. And he says that I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me, and guess what? You'll all be one with us too, one day. If this is a claim to be Yahweh, then, well, lucky us, I suppose.
Alex is absolutely right to point out that when Jesus is accused of claiming to be God in John 10, his response isn't to confirm it. It's to quote Psalm 82, where other beings are called gods metaphorically. This shows Jesus is not identifying as Yahweh, but rather as someone set apart, like those divine agents. Now Christians often treat I and the Father are one as a declaration of divinity, but in John 17, Jesus uses the exact same Greek word hen to say he wants his followers to be one with God in the same way he is. If oneness with God makes Jesus divine, then all believers must be too, which is obviously not Christian theology. Jesus clearly means unity of purpose, not identity of nature. And when he says, the Father lives in me, that isn't divine possession. In John 14, he says the same thing will happen to his followers. You are in me, and I am in you. Again, it's about spiritual unity, not ontology. As Hitchens pointed out again and again, if this were really God in human form, he wouldn't speak in riddles. He wouldn't need theologians and translators 2,000 years later to explain what he supposedly meant. The fact that Jesus never clearly says, I am God, in any gospel, shows that the claim of divinity is a later church invention, not something Jesus ever taught.
I showed that in the first century there was an interesting discussion within Judaism about the two powers in heaven. They had various ways of dealing with this. And we can see why when we read passages like Genesis 22, the story of Abraham and Isaac. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So this is God saying to Abraham, take your son. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, is when he starts to do it. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So this is the angel of the Lord saying, you haven't withheld from me your only son. And it was God who ordered Abraham to do this. So we have situations like this, and I argue that Jesus enters the discussion when they're confused about the two powers in heaven and claims to be one of them. And so there we looked at what Jesus says, what Jesus does, what his friends say, what his friends do, what his enemies say, and what his enemies do. Alex seems to suggest that there could be some sort of angel or something like this, or even a person who's endowed with this kind of divine authority. I got problems with this even here in Genesis. So look at what this said. Then the Lord, Genesis 33, then the Lord said to Moses, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you, because you are stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. Who is accompanying them and guiding them? Well, the angel of the Lord. But here he says, I'm not going with you this time. So this is the Lord speaking. It's not the angel of the Lord, and you say, oh, this is the Lord. This is the Lord speaking. This is the Lord speaking, says, I'm not going up with you now, when it was the angel of the Lord who was accompanying them. So these are the sorts of things you have, and people tried to figure out how to deal with this. And they came up, again, with all sorts of ways, and Jesus entered the picture and claimed to be one of the two powers in heaven. So what Jesus says, we went through 3 examples of Jesus claiming to be one of the two powers. He's the divine Son of the Father, he's the Lord of King David, and he's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And we saw how people reacted to him claiming to be the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. In response, Alex was quoted Psalm 82, and then Jesus using this passage. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So they accused Jesus of claiming to be God. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? So Jesus is sent into the world, according to this passage. Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? This is not, and I have no idea how you would ever read the Gospel of John like this, let alone anything else Jesus said. This is not Jesus saying, what? You're misunderstanding. I'm just a regular dude. Again, if this were the only verse in there, maybe, because given the rest of what we read in the Gospel of John and the rest of the Gospels, Jesus is not claiming to be a regular guy. He's using a legal technicality here that they should be aware of. They're saying, hey, here's what you're claiming. You're claiming to be the Son of God. This means you're claiming to be equal to God and so on, and therefore, this is blasphemy. And Jesus' response is, well, really? Well, in the Psalms, God calls people Elohim. Therefore, you can't just say calling someone some divine title is blasphemous and deserves a death sentence. You have to show that that the title is not from God, that it's not true, that it's false. Have you done that? No. Okay, you can't kill me. You can't just say there's a claim and therefore we will kill you over it. So it's a legal technicality. Again, if you're somehow reading this as, see, Jesus is just claiming to be a regular guy, wow. All right. So we have John 17:5. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. Why? Alex quoted John 17 to show that Jesus is just claiming some regular relationship that we can all have with God or something along those lines. What does Jesus say in the same chapter that Alex is quoting? And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. That sounds like Jesus is claiming to have glory with the Father before the world began. Doesn't sound like he's claiming to be a regular guy. Doesn't sound like he's saying, oh, you guys are just misunderstanding everything I said. It's just one big misunderstanding. So what Jesus does, we've looked at it. I think he said he's going to respond to it. So what does Jesus do? He's the judge. He's the final judge of all people, according to him. Again, the Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who's going to sit on his throne in judgment. Jesus said, yeah, that's me. The Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who raises the dead. Jesus says that he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. The people in their graves are going to hear the voice of the Son of God. Now that is very strange if that's how we all are. We're all going to be raised from the dead by the Son of God. If that's him saying, oh, we're all just the same and we can all, you'll be in me and I'll be in you. Very strange way of putting things.
Let's be clear. When Jesus is accused in John 10 of claiming to be God, he doesn't affirm it. He deflects. He quotes Psalm 82, where the term gods refers to human beings, members of a divine council, or even unjust earthly judges, not divine beings equal to Yahweh. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and John J. Collins agree. This psalm uses the term gods in a figurative or functional sense, not literal divinity. If Jesus wanted to confirm he was God, he had every opportunity, but instead, he points to a passage that describes non-divine beings being called gods, and then says, why do you accuse me of blasphemy for saying I'm the Son of God? That's not affirmation, it's distancing. And when he says I and the Father are one, he later uses the same Greek word hen to pray that his disciples will all be one with him and the Father in the same way. If oneness with God means literal divinity, then all believers are divine. That's clearly not the intent. Scholars like James D.G. Dunn and Raymond Brown point out that John's gospel uses metaphorical language, not strict metaphysical definitions. Jesus being in the Father is about spiritual unity and purpose, not substance. In fact, Jesus consistently refers to God as someone other than himself. My Father, the one who sent me, greater than I. That's not how you talk if you're claiming you are that same God.
We heard about the angel of Yahweh and the suggestion that this might indeed just be Jesus. It might be. Look, I don't claim to be the sort of final authority on exegesis here. I'm simply asking you to consider what you think is a more appropriate explanation. I've suggested the divine name-bearing model as opposed to the two powers in heaven. And when I look at passages such as Exodus 23, verses 20 to 21, see, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him. I just ask which interpretation lends itself more nicely to the passages. David's rebuttal there seemed to suggest that I was under the impression that Jesus is just some dude. That is far, far from the case, especially in John's Gospel, where Jesus seems to posit himself as something of a model of faith for his disciples. And for what it's worth, this is kind of the image that I get of Jesus reading through the Gospels. What is he supposed to be? Something like an idyllic, faithful servant of God, and certainly in a special position. If you include the epistles in particular, then Jesus is, of course, exalted. But I want to get into that, but I suppose I should turn to Philippians chapter 2, which David mentions. Of course, we're not talking about Jesus' own words anymore, but it's still quite interesting what people came to believe. The mindset of Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, but rather made himself nothing, as I'm sure you all know. That word grasped there, harpagmon, or something like that. I'm not very good at pronouncing the Greek, but it means something like to steal, to seize. Isn't it a bit strange that if Jesus is God, he didn't consider equality with God as something to be seized, to be stolen? That's how that word is used in the Greek language. How can he steal something that's already rightfully his? And indeed, because he then died on the cross and humbled himself even to death, therefore he was given the name that was above all other names. Therefore. So whatever exalted position Jesus is given here in Philippians 2, and by the way, he is given it. He's given it because of his crucifixion. Therefore, he's given the name above other names. Again, which interpretation lends itself more nicely to these passages? For what it's worth, my favorite interpretation, I was discussing this the other night at dinner with, well, not with David actually, that would be giving too much away, but is this so-called Adamic. James Dunn has written about this, the sort of Adam Christology as applies to Philippians 2, who being in the very nature of God, this word meaning like the form of God. If we consider that Jesus is supposed to be the answer to Adam's sin and Jesus redeems. Adam is made in the image of God and considers equality with God as something to be grasped, to be seized when he takes of the fruit and eats it. And that is how man falls. So how is man redeemed? Well, Jesus Christ, though also being made in the form of a God, in the image of God, did not consider equality with God something to be seized. Not him, but humbled himself. Therefore, Jesus is exalted. We're told in Hebrews chapter 2 that for a time Jesus is made lower than the angels, presumably while he's here on earth. Again, it just reads to me as if at least while on earth, Jesus is certainly not approximating Yahweh, but he's also not just some dude. David mentioned the glory that's given to Jesus in John chapter 17, verse 5, the same chapter that I was using. Yeah. Verse 5, Father, glorify me in the presence that I had with you before the world was created. Just keep reading John chapter 17 and see what Jesus wants to do with that glory. In fact, the very passage that I quoted, my prayer is not for them alone, I pray that all may be one, Father, just as you're in me and I'm in you. May they also be in us, blah, blah, blah. Immediately afterwards, so they may be brought into complete unity. Then they will know, I've copied the wrong passage actually, Jesus says that the glory you've given me, I will give to them. In John chapter 17. He says, the glory you've given me, I will give to them, the disciples. We're told in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, that God shares his glory with nobody. And this is sometimes a suggestion that's made is sometimes that because Jesus says, glorify me, God, in John chapter 17, he must be God because God shares his glory with nobody. But people just seem to forget that in the same chapter, Jesus says that he will give the glory that he has been given by the Father to the disciples too. Again, all I'm asking you to consider is however you interpret these verses where Jesus is given glory, Jesus is given the judgment, and bear in mind that Jesus is given all of these things, what he then does with those things, and whether he delegates them to other people. Because if he does, then it's clearly not just something that can be delegated to God himself. Only God judges. Only God can judge, but Jesus says that he will judge. Jesus also promises judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel to the disciples. So are the disciples God? Jesus forgives sins, and only God can forgive sins.
Alex raises a crucial point here. If Jesus were God, why does the New Testament describe his authority, glory, and name as something given to him, not inherently possessed? Philippians 2 clearly states that because Jesus humbled himself, therefore God exalted him. If he already was God, why does he need to be exalted? The Greek word harpagmon, often translated grasped or seized, reinforces this. Scholars like James Dunn and N.T. Wright explain that it refers to something not already possessed, something that would be taken by force, not by right. Jesus didn't seize equality with God because, by the author's view, he didn't have it in the first place. And when Jesus says in John 17, "The glory you have given me I have given to them," it completely undermines the argument that divine glory proves divinity. According to Isaiah, God shares his glory with no one. Yet Jesus shares it with his disciples. That's not something Yahweh would do. Unless, of course, Jesus is not Yahweh. Even judgment and forgiveness, things supposedly exclusive to God, are given to the disciples in the Gospels. In Matthew 19:28, Jesus promises the 12 will judge the tribes of Israel. Does that make them divine too? Clearly not. So the simplest, most coherent reading is this. Jesus was an exalted, chosen figure, a servant of God, not God himself. If Jesus was God, why does he constantly act as if he isn't?
But is the historical issue here then that you think that this claim that the Messiah had been raised was kind of a post facto kind of sort of rationalization of these experiences they had?
They thought he was the Messiah before he died, in my judgment.
Right, so they did think he was the Messiah.
They weren't expecting him to die.
Right.
He died. One of them, two of them, three of them said, "I've seen the Lord." And then they had to figure out, well, how does that work? And it must mean, if he's alive again, it must mean that God's raised him from the dead.
But there were other...
These are apocalyptic Jews. Apocalyptic Jews, the only way they can imagine life after death is an embodied existence. They don't believe the soul lives on after death. These are Jews. Jews believe that the body and soul are one thing, and that afterlife, if there is an afterlife, it's body and soul. No, that if they see Jesus alive afterwards, it must mean that his soul has come back into his body. How does that happen? It can only happen when God does it.
Okay.
God has raised him from the dead. Once they say they raised him from the dead and they already knew he was the Messiah, that's when they start saying the Messiah was raised.
Quick response and we'll go to a break and then we'll carry on.
I was just going to say, but there's other categories that they could have, as Jews, thought of. The Maccabees died horrible deaths and they believed they lived on, exalted in the heaven. And they, you have many other examples of this kind of disembodied continuing to live on, but they will rise again at the final resurrection. But what the early Christians said is that Jesus had risen again now. The resurrection had already begun. Bart agrees with that. But where did that idea come from? That's the unexpectedness.
Yeah, it came from
completely unexpected. Right. But you're saying they put it together. You're saying they're the geniuses who put this innovative, unparalleled idea that has changed the world. That all goes back to the brain of Mary Magdalene?
I'm changing the world has nothing to do with it. The issue is, what does an apocalyptic Jew...
It did change the world, though, right?
What does an apocalyptic Jew think if they see somebody who had died, who's alive now? Now, when you see your grandmother in your bedroom 2 weeks after she died, typically today, this happens a lot, 1 out of 8 people in our country have a vision of a deceased loved one and are convinced they're alive again or that they're alive. In our context, we believe that the body and the soul are separable, and the soul lives on afterwards. So when you see your grandmother in your bedroom, as 1 out of 8 people, not necessarily your grandmother, but some beloved one, typically what you think is their soul's gone to heaven, they've come down to visit me. Because that's our mentality of an afterlife.
But
apocalypticists don't have that. They don't have that view. Their view is that if somebody's alive after they died, it has to be a resurrection because the soul doesn't exist outside the body. So when they see Jesus, he's got to have a soul back in the body, which means God has raised him from the dead. That's the first thing they know, and they don't have any theology about it. It's just, oh my God, he's come back from the dead, and then they work it out.
Quick response, and we'll go to our break.
No, Josephus, for example, definitely believes souls exist.
He's not an
outside.
apocalyptic Jew.
Well, why
he's
not?
He's anti-apocalyptic. I don't know if you've studied Josephus. Josephus is famously anti-apocalyptic. We're talking about apocalyptic Jews.
Bart assumes that they just saw something, but he hasn't explained to us what they saw. And whatever they saw changed their complete worldview.
I don't know what you see when you see your grandmother either.
Okay, but I definitely don't say she's raised from the dead.
You say she's still alive.
Well, but she's still dead, though, right?
In Jesus' case, my point is...
In our case, if you're going to use that parallel, in our case, when we see someone in the afterlife, yes, we think they're still alive in heaven, but we say they're dead here on earth.
We say their body is dead.
That's not what the early Christians said.
That's right.
They said Jesus had risen from the dead.
Right. So you need to listen.
A crucified man had risen from the dead.
Yes, you need to listen to why that is. We say their body is dead and their soul is alive because we believe in the difference between the body and the soul. Apocalyptic Jews did not. They could not say that his soul is still living because his body can't be alive unless his soul comes back into it. They don't have our view of the separation of body.
I disagree with you.
Well, look, we're going to take a break there.
Really?
We're going to take a break.
Okay, tell me some.
When a few early followers said they saw Jesus after his death, that alone doesn't prove a resurrection. Psychological studies show that grief hallucinations are incredibly common. About 13% of bereaved people report vivid visions of deceased loved ones. These aren't random. They're often shaped by cultural expectations. And for apocalyptic Jews, the group Jesus and his followers belong to, resurrection didn't mean a ghost or a soul in heaven. It meant bodily revival. Their worldview didn't support the idea of a disembodied soul living on. So if someone thought they saw Jesus, they interpreted it as a physical resurrection. Not because it happened, but because they had no other framework for understanding that experience. This isn't speculation. Jewish texts like the Book of Daniel show their belief in a future bodily resurrection, not some eternal spirit world. And when Paul writes decades later, even he never describes seeing a physical Jesus, only a revelation or vision. That suggests the original resurrection claim likely started with grief-induced visions, not an empty tomb.
Just add, Bart says this is happening all the time. Where does someone project an enemy apparition? What example
it
do you
happens
have?
sometimes. If you feel guilty, for example, if you feel guilty about what you've done to somebody leading to...
Give me an example.
Well, if you read the psychological literature on visions, you actually find a good bit of it.
Anything specific?
Well, they aren't names that you would... They're just people. They're just people,
Pretty sure. Not in the literature. Not in the literature. No.
Okay, well, I suggest you read it.
There is no projection of enemies in the literature. Dale Allison would
yeah. So
what
I'd say is that some people have hypothesized that Paul felt very guilty, or that Peter felt very guilty about his denial of Jesus, and that he started out, and so because of his guilt, he saw something. It's very common. One of the most common reasons for seeing a bereaved loved one is because you felt like you mistreated them before they died, and the guilt creates and so.
But again, that doesn't guarantee saying an unparalleled claim of resurrection of a Messiah that was crucified. He could have felt like he forgave him, but it doesn't mean he would have said that.
And not only that, but I've never said it did. And so that isn't my claim.
You said that what caused Peter's claim?
Peter did not...
He didn't claim Jesus rose from the dead?
Okay. What I've been saying is Peter did not claim that the Messiah got raised from the dead the second he saw Jesus. What he thought was Jesus had come back to life.
You're saying he figured it out as an apocalyptic Jew. I'm going with your argument, yeah. But Paul, how does Paul imagine
I was getting to that.
Crucified man
I was getting to that.
Rising from the dead that he hates, that he thinks cursed by God, appearing to him? I'm looking forward to that one.
Okay, go ahead, Bart.
So Paul did not get this information from Peter and James. Paul was persecuting Christians before he ever met Peter and James. So he knows the Christian claims already. There have been a lot of psychological analyses about what might have happened to somebody who feels guilt over what they're doing to these people that would generate a vision and to have a conversion. As you probably know, there are instances in which people who are enemies of Christ have visions in which they get converted. And so Paul would be in that category.
Yeah. Okay. But again, Sundar Singh, by the way, would be a great example of this. This was an Indian that became a great missionary. He was burning Bibles. He was persecuting Christians in the early 1900s, and ultimately he had a vision of Jesus, and he was transformed like Paul. But again, that happened after the Christian claim has already been made.
Yes, so did Paul. So did Paul.
Yeah.
That's my point. It's exactly the same. So you can't say that it doesn't happen to enemies.
So you think he understood...
Because you just gave the example of an enemy where it happened.
So you think he understood the Christian claim clearly as he was persecuted?
He understood that they were saying Jesus got raised from the dead, absolutely. Okay.
And then
why else is he persecuted?
And then he imagined on the Damascus Road...
I didn't say he imagined anything on the Damascus Road.
Well, what happened on the Damascus Road?
I just said that there are lots of options and we don't know because he doesn't tell us.
Okay. Well, he said he saw the Lord Jesus. That's what he said.
He said he saw the Lord Jesus. But what did where did he see him? When did he see him? How did he see him? How close was him? Did they talk? Did they spend a week together?
Seeing him's good enough, right?
He thought he saw Jesus. I've been saying that all along. He thought he saw Jesus.
I'm not expecting.
I'm asking why you don't believe him. Why do you think Paul's wrong?
Why don't I think a person got raised from the dead?
Yes.
Oh.
Why don't you think Jesus got raised from the dead?
I don't think anybody gets raised from the dead. Okay. Because it violates the laws of nature.
Okay.
I mean,
so you have the kind of a materialist, fundamentalist view.
Well, let me ask this. You think God raised Jesus from the dead, right? Do you think God can break the laws of mathematics? Can God
can't contradict himself, no. Because he is...
Exactly.
Mathematics is his language.
That's right. The other language he uses is physics. Can he break the laws of physics?
I mean, I think we're getting off.
No, we are not. This is precisely... You asked me why I don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is because it violates the laws of physics.
And I don't think God... He can feed things into his system, for sure.
I don't think God can break the law of physics any more than he can break the law of mathematics.
Feeding things into his system to bring a dead person to life is not the same thing as making 2 + 2 5. That's completely different things.
They are both laws that have never been broken in history.
Except in the case of Jesus, right?
So here's the question. This is it's a very big question, because what you're arguing is that the most probable event that happens with Jesus, because Paul and Peter said it happened, the most probable thing is the violation of a law of physics that has never been violated in 13.8 billion years. Never. Except in this one instance. Now, if you're a historian, historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's an incredible evidence to
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
not just
so.
that. Not just that.
When someone says, Paul saw Jesus, and that proves the resurrection, they're missing a critical point. Paul himself never describes seeing a physical Jesus. He only reports a vision. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists Jesus appearing to people, including himself, but never says it was a body anyone could touch. And let's be clear, Paul wasn't a neutral witness. He already knew the resurrection claim, so his experience, whatever it was, came after the idea was already spreading. Visions like this are well documented. People under intense guilt, stress, or trauma often experience vivid hallucinations, especially during radical life shifts. A 2019 meta-study on religious visions showed that many so-called divine encounters happen in similar psychological states. Bart's point isn't just theory. It's supported by research in bereavement psychology, where guilt and grief often lead to mental projections of lost or even resented figures. The Christian apologist's example of Sundar Singh, someone who also had a vision and converted, doesn't help their case. It actually proves Bart's. Emotional trauma can produce powerful religious experiences that feel real, but aren't evidence of a supernatural event. And Bart nails it. If you're claiming the only time in history that the laws of physics were broken was in one unverified event 2,000 years ago based on a vision, you're not doing history. You're asking for blind faith. And historians don't work that way.
We're just getting started.
What's interesting here for me, Bart, though, is that presumably on the face of it, if you do believe that God would never, if there is a God, let's say, that God would never break the laws of physics, then on the faces of it, no amount of evidence could persuade you of a miraculous claim. You've kind of decided that before you come to the text.
What you'd have to do is you'd have to have evidence from physicists that these laws don't apply.
Okay, so you'd have to go to the physicist rather than the historian.
You certainly can prove it, because physicists...
So we need to go to the physicists for the evidence.
Well, if you're going to say that the laws of physics have been broken one time in the history of the human race, then you need pretty good evidence. And the evidence that somebody said they saw somebody...
But that's not the only evidence, and we're going to talk about more. But that's not the only evidence. We were talking about the appearances, and the appearances, I think, and you've said this, and I've appreciated you said this in how Jesus became God. You talk about how basically the evidence is consistent with if Jesus did rise from the dead. And I appreciate that, because you're saying if Jesus rose from the dead, basically the evidence we have looks the same. It would look the same. So you don't believe he rose from the dead, but the evidence does support the miracle. Do you agree with that?
No, of course I don't.
Well, okay, consistent with the miracle. Is it consistent with the miracle?
Let me put it this way. There is a famous Jewish holy man, Baal Shem Tov, who eyewitnesses have told us, lived in the 18th century, he told us he could heal the sick, he could cast out demons, he could raise the dead. We have eyewitness accounts of this. And my suspicion is that you don't think it really happened, because you'd be suspicious of those reports.
I think the fact that nobody outside of Hasidic Jews think it happened is quite
okay. Who outside of Christians think that Jesus was raised from the dead?
Pinchas Lapid. He was a Jewish historian and scholar. He wrote a book called The Resurrection of Jesus. You should read it. It's actually really good. He actually was convinced by the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead.
Right. Okay.
You should read it. It's really good.
I guess the point is, if you come to believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead physically, it's quite likely you will become a Christian. So
if you believe the miracles of Baal Shem Tov, then you become a Hasidic Jew.
And I also point out
so that is an evidence that Baal Shem Tov really did these things, because somebody believes and then converts. So it's not evidence.
And I would also add that there are scholars that I appreciate, people like E.P. Sanders. I know you respect E.P. Sanders. Like in Jesus and Judaism, the way he ends is basically saying, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But he admits the evidence is pretty strong. There's people that admit the evidence is strong, but they still don't go all the way.
I guess my question is...
I think the evidence, though, is strong. I don't think that's...
You haven't cited any all you've cited so far are eyewitnesses. And you've agreed that eyewitnesses in other cases don't work for you, including Baal Shem Tov. And so I'd like to know, why do you choose some eyewitnesses over others?
Again, this goes back to Moroni. Nobody outside of those few people believed Moroni appeared to them. Nobody outside of certain Hasidic Jews believed that Baal Shem Tov did miracles.
How about Mormons?
How about Christians?
How about Mormons?
I just said nobody believes those miraculous claims happen outside.
Yes, well, nobody outside of the Christian faith thinks that Jesus is the Son of God who was raised from the dead.
No. But like Paul, for example, is an enemy that got convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. Who is the Paul for Baal Shem Tov? Tell me who he is.
Well, there are a lot of Hasidic Jews who didn't start out as Hasidic Jews who read these stories and become convinced.
But who's a Paul? Who's someone who was persecuting the Hasidic Jews and then got convinced by the Baal Shem Tov miracles? You bring all these people up, but it's insane. I mean, Jesus is completely unparalleled, completely different than all these rest.
You are a Christian. You've always been a Christian. Of course you think that Jesus is the greatest thing ever. And so I understand
almost said that you think Jesus is the most compassionate, the most influential, amazing person. You said
I don't
that
think
he's
he's
close
most
to that.
compassionate. No, I don't know. But so you're in the Christian tradition and you want to show that you're right. And, so, okay.
I want to just demonstrate that Jesus is Lord because he
as a historian.
died for our sins, and I want people to know that.
Exactly. Yeah. You're a theologian, and that's fine. I have no qualms with you as a theologian. What I have qualms with is you claiming that you're doing this on disinterested historical ground.
It's a historical religion. If it didn't happen in history, it didn't happen.
But if you're going to be a historian, you have to treat every religion equally, and not giving superiority to your particular faith.
But if you're going to be a historian, you need to be open-minded to miracles.
Yes, you're open-minded to everything.
No,
I am open-minded, yes. If you can show...
you said that the physics can't be...
I did say that.
Defied.
No. You didn't hear me.
Okay.
I said, you're saying it happened once in the entire human race. How many people have lived? I don't know how many people have lived on, billions of people. Mm-hmm. There are 8 billion people alive today. None of them is going to rise from the dead. How many people have risen from the dead? In your judgment, 1 out of, 20 billion who have lived or something. How many people have mistaken something they've seen? How many people have had a dream that they thought was something that was real? How many people have had a vision of a deceased loved one afterwards? Millions.
Right.
I mean, this is basically Hume's argument, isn't it? You know, against miracles. That essentially
so I'm different from Hume. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying that if you're...
So you're saying a historian can discover miracles in history then? You are saying that?
I wish you wouldn't put words in my lips.
Okay. Because I said you seem to be closed-minded as a historian on miracles.
Let me repeat it because I don't think you heard it. I'm saying that historians establish what probably happened on the past on the basis of probabilities. If the probability is 1 out of 800 billion or something versus 1 out of 8, what do historians think about that? Do they think it's more likely that the laws of physics are broken? Even they grant, okay, laws of physics could be, suppose they grant that. Do they say it did happen in this one instance because we have these 3 people who said it happened? Or do they say maybe they missaw something?
Okay. Justin, and then we'll move on to your next bedrock fact.
We talked about 107 billion people, that have walked the planet. That's fine. Out of those 107 billion people, how many of those people, those human beings, are worshipped by billions of people and called Lord and God today?
I don't know what the number is.
One.
So 107 billion. So how many? How many of those have been?
Let me finish my. Please let me finish my point. No. This is my turn.
Okay.
I'll
let you respond.
I thought you wanted me to respond to that.
Jesus is the only person.
You asked me a question.
Okay.
You asked me a question. You wanted to know how many, and I was trying to answer your question. So may I answer your question?
Tell me someone else other than Jesus that's worshipped by billions.
I'm answering by asking you.
Oh, no, see, that's not, you weren't answering the question.
Okay, I will answer the question.
So let me at least finish my point.
107 billion, you can't say that more people worship Jesus now, therefore he was raised from the dead.
Okay.
Because, let me finish.
Let me finish my point. I was making a point.
I'm answering your question.
You weren't answering the question.
You asked me my question, and I'm answering it now. Let me finish my question.
And then you come back.
You say 107 billion, and since more people worship Jesus now, that's evidence.
No, that's not what I said.
Okay, then
so let me finish.
Okay.
So I'm saying what we have here is an extraordinary, by exactly these exact odds that you're talking about, we have an extraordinary anomaly. We have one human being who walked this earth from the last, billions of years, and however long humans have been on the earth. Out of 107 billion, this one human being is worshipped by billions and called Lord and God. I'm saying that is an extraordinary anomaly. And so I'm saying that's something that historians would go, wow, that kind of is amazing. If Jesus achieved that extraordinary anomaly, 1 out of 107 billion on that point, maybe he achieved another extraordinary anomaly. Maybe he rose from the dead.
Okay. Are you really using that as a historical argument?
I'm using it as an argument for the resurrection, whatever you want to call it.
What kind of argument would you call it?
Well, what's your problem with the argument?
But isn't it an extraordinary anomaly that Jesus is worshipped by billions? How is a crucified man...
No, it's not an anomaly at all. I wrote an entire book explaining how it happened.
Okay, how does a crucified man in his mid-30s, how is he worshipped by billions of people today? I mean, you don't think that's not an extraordinary anomaly?
It's not an anomaly. It's amazing.
By definition, mathematics, 1 out of 107 billion. But I'll let you finish.
Why is that proof that he was raised from the dead? It's proof that people are convinced he was raised from the dead.
I said it's a good argument against this idea that you were making that, you're telling me only one person out of all the 107 billion rose from the dead? A historian can't say that. That's not good enough evidence. Well, here's another point on that same person that is an extraordinary anomaly.
But you can't explain that one. You can explain why there are so many billions of Christians in the world. It's not hard to explain, without a miraculous explanation. So why? I don't understand why you're arguing this.
But this single individual has had this kind of impact.
Yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
So it's normal for crucified men in the ancient world that are Jews to be worshipped by billions and lay the foundations of Western civilization. This is normal.
You are not listening.
As Justin Bass grew frustrated and emotional, Bart Ehrman stayed grounded, calmly pointing out what actual historians rely on: evidence, not popularity or faith. Christianity's growth doesn't prove resurrection any more than Islam's global expansion proves Muhammad split the moon. Religious influence isn't rare. It's predictable. Sociologists and historians like Rodney Stark have shown that Christianity's rise was helped by social networks, Roman infrastructure, and centuries of political backing, not a miracle. In fact, mass belief in supernatural events happens across all major religions and cults, from Hindu milk-drinking statues to Marian apparitions. None of those are treated as historical facts, and neither should Jesus' resurrection. Bard also nailed the core problem. No credible historian would say a one-time violation of natural law is more probable than people being mistaken, especially when visions, hallucinations, and false memories are well documented in grief psychology. Studies show up to 60% of grieving people experience vivid visions of the deceased. That's not rare. What's rare is building a theology on it. So the real question is, do we rewrite physics for one ancient claim backed by a few biased followers? Or do we accept the far more likely explanation that stories evolved, beliefs spread, and people were wrong?
Considered perfectly all right, in fact, a religious duty to blow up the mosques, to destroy the religious schools of other Muslims, of the Muslims of another school, not unlike the pattern of Belfast. It's not enough to have faith, you must have the right version of your own faith, or risk death, mutilation, and humiliation, and the destruction, the immiseration, the torture of Iraqi society is something that all of us can read about every day. Suppose we're to go to Beirut, the pearl of the Levant, the most civilized and beautiful and cultured city of the Middle East, and to see what happens when, for politicized reasons, a sectarian constitution is in place which says that the president of Lebanon must always be a Maronite Christian, that the speaker of its parliament must always be a Shia, that its vice president must always be a Sunni, that the Druze must have their share. Who is going to argue that the matter of faith, that the religious allegiance, that the preachings of religion have not in all these cases gravely exacerbated, gravely deepened, gravely poisoned and prolonged all of these things that have made our tenuous civilization extremely difficult to defend, uphold, maintain, let alone to advance? I don't believe this case could be made. That's for a simple reason, because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made. And it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Well, why do we deceive ourselves on this point?
Christopher Hitchens, author, journalist, critic, writer over here, a figure in the cultural life of this country before he moved to Washington, where he wrote for Vanity Fair and The Nation. He started off on the left wing, moved very right, and has recently been defending the neocons. And his latest book, which is absolutely germane to this subject, is to be published in the coming months and is called God is Not Great. Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, John. You'll give me a minute, won't you? Thank you very much, Joan, for that slightly misleading introduction to someone who may no longer be a socialist, but still vibrates to Marxism. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I think I'll be able to be reasonably terse, given the very heavy artillery that follows me on our side. I think it might perhaps have been felt when I was chosen that the case for atheism should not be made by the spokesman for its moderate wing, Richard Dawkins. It might be okay to have at least one extremist on the panel. And I'll begin at once by recalling an exchange I had recently in Colorado Springs with a spokesman of America's evangelical broadcasting wing, a much overrated but nonetheless significant force in American politics. This broadcaster asked me, in response to my own statement of unbelief, he said, "I insist that you answer the following question, and that you answer it with a yes or a no." I braced myself. I accepted the challenge unseen. He said, "You are to imagine yourself in a strange city where you've never been before. You are to imagine nightfall coming on, and you to be without friends or succor in this town. And you are to ask yourself whether you would feel safer or less safe when you saw a dozen men coming towards you in the dusk, if you were to know that they had recently come from a prayer meeting." This is I think I can justifiably say I'm relaying to you, comrades, friends, brothers, sisters, the challenge that was put by the religious to me. You'll see at once it's not a yes-no answer. You can't give a yes-no answer to that, but I accept it anyway. I said, very well, I won't give a Sesame Street reply, but just without leaving the letter B, I have been in that situation. In Bombay, in Belfast, in Beirut, in Belgrade, in Baghdad, and many other places too. And I won't tell you about all of them, but let me just, as it were, fill in some of those latent blanks. In Belfast, the capital city of one of the provinces of this, our United Kingdom, as everybody here knows, everything, culturally, educationally, economically, politically, socially, has been very gravely retarded for at least a quarter of a century. At least half a century and maybe more since partition, and before that, because partition is both the outcome and the cause of sectarian warfare in this town, by the simple fact that there are people there who are willing to kill not just one another, but one another's children on the basis of what kind of Christian they are. Horrible things are done, not just in pubs and clubs, but on the streets, on housing estates, on university campuses in that city still, despite the relatively good news we've had today, where the situation remains dominated by barbaric sectarian party leaders, on this and no other basis. Both churches demand that their children are sent to separate schools. They each agree with the other that above all things, their own children must be protected from the faith of another faith.
Hitchens is pointing out something we keep seeing across history. Whenever faith controls politics, the result is division and bloodshed. Take Iraq after Saddam fell. What the country needed was peace and time to rebuild. Instead, Sunni and Shia militias turned on each other, bombing mosques and schools. Studies estimate that between 2003 and 2011, more than 100,000 civilians were killed, most of them in sectarian attacks. Religion wasn't a shield, it was the excuse for murder. Lebanon is another example. Its constitution literally forces political power to be divided by religion. The president must be a Maronite Christian, the Speaker of Parliament a Shia, the Prime Minister a Sunni. That might sound balanced, but it locked people into sectarian identity and fueled a civil war that killed over 100,000 people. Even today, that religious system leaves the country stuck in corruption and collapse. And Bosnia in the 1990s showed the same story. Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks slaughtered each other in the name of faith. The Srebrenica massacre alone saw 8,000 Muslim men and boys executed while priests and imams blessed soldiers on both sides. The Bible itself doesn't help. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, Paul says, "Do not be yoked with unbelievers." That kind of thinking, separating people by belief, is exactly what fuels sectarianism. Even today, Hindu nationalists in India persecute Muslims and Christians, while Christian nationalists in America use their faith to justify violence, like what we saw during the Capitol riots in 2021. The pattern is always the same. When religion defines identity, humanity comes second.
I don't think I need to elaborate very much more on how horrendous the consequences of that have been and how they are enshrined, by the way, in our own constitution, which mandates that our own head of the church is also the head of the state and of the armed forces, with all the ludicrous Windsor consequences that you get if you found a national church on the family values of Henry VIII. These conditions, which are farcical in England, Wales, and Scotland, are tragic and ugly, only a few minutes flying time from where we sit. If I pass on from Belfast to, say, Baghdad, where I've recently been, and without reopening any of the arguments about the rightness or otherwise of the coalition intervention in Mesopotamia, I think it can be granted by any fair-minded person that what was most needed in Iraq after 30 years of fascism and war was a period of reflection, a short interlude of calm, during which Iraqis could look about themselves and decide perhaps for whom they'd like to vote, perhaps what kind of country they'd like to live in, what kind of federal system they might wish to evolve, and to do so unmolested by violence or terror. The parties of God have vetoed every hope of that process. The parties of God now have the Iraqi people in their jaws, and they're saying to them, it's not enough just to kill foreigners or to rail against Jews or Christians or secularists. That's nothing like enough. It's only in Iraq, not only, mainly, chiefly in Iraq, that it's considered perfectly all right, in fact, a religious duty to blow up the mosques, to destroy the religious schools of other Muslims, of the Muslims of another school, not unlike the pattern of Belfast. It's not enough to have faith, you must have the right version of your own faith, or risk death, mutilation, and humiliation, and the destruction, the immiseration, the torture of Iraqi society is something that all of us can read about every day. Suppose we're to go to Beirut, the pearl of the Levant, the most civilized and beautiful and cultured city of the Middle East, and to see what happens when, for politicized reasons, a sectarian constitution is in place which says that the president of Lebanon must always be a Maronite Christian, that the speaker of its parliament must always be a Shia, that its vice president must always be a Sunni, that the Druze must have their share, and so on, leaving out at the very bottom, I'm afraid, such forces as Kurds and Armenians, but making everyone defined in their citizenship by their faith. Do I need to elaborate what that's done to retard, to bankrupt, to beggar, to disfigure, and to degrade what could have been an ideally plural and diverse and happy society? Remaining with letter B, shall I say Banja Luka? Shall I say Belgrade? Or just say Bosnia? Again, one of the most civilized enclaves of the Balkans. For many years, protected by a secular constitution and the remains of what had been a secular and democratic republic. And just look what happens when it is decided that it is a matter of faith that determines your citizenship, your allegiance, your identity, your nature, your rights. See the recrudescence in the Europe of the late 20th and early 21st century of Catholic fascist parties we thought we'd left behind at Nuremberg, the Ustasha. The recrudescence of forces like the Chetniks, the Serbian Orthodox fascists who took exactly the same view except the other way around. See the craven way in which our spineless media, which always defers to people of faith, say that it was Serbs who shelled Sarajevo or Croats who shelled Mostar, when what they should have been saying was, today the Christian Orthodox militia bombarded an open city round the clock, or yesterday the Catholic forces shelled Mostar from dawn till dusk. They didn't do it because it's a matter of taste. We're supposed to respect people of faith, and we're supposed to respect them while they do that and do that and make this sort of excuse. There aren't enough words, in my lexicon at any rate, to express the contempt that I think any right-thinking person must feel for this conscription of this kind of medieval barbarism. Joan will tell me when I've got a minute. I don't know whether I'm yet trespassing on my rivals and my allies' time, but if I was to add Bombay to this list, the city that was very nearly ruined by the sectarian partition of India in 1947, 1948, where once again people were told it's a matter of faith what kind of Indian you are. You may have to become a Pakistani if you're Muslim. You may have to lose your life on the proposition. You may not just be a Hindu. Bombay more or less survived this, the terrifying ethnic cleansing and the pogrom that ensued when the subcontinent was mutilated and maimed and partitioned on this basis in the hopes of a genuine Indian unity and independence, ruined by way of appeasement of people of faith. But Bombay sort of recovered until recently, when now its name has been changed, its minority citizens persecuted, intimidated, driven out by a new Hindu nationalist party, the Shiv Sena, that says that, again, if you do not follow the right God, if you don't accept the supernatural as a real force in everyday life, you are not worth whatever it takes to become or to remain or be treated as an ordinary, democratic, civilized human being in, again, one of the great cities of Asia.
In Nazi Germany, the Catholic Church signed the Reich Concordat with Hitler in 1933 and remained silent through years of persecution. In Franco's Spain, bishops openly blessed fascist troops. That's not secular tyranny. It's religion standing behind brutality. The same goes for communism. Stalin and Mao built personality cults that looked exactly like religions, complete with sacred texts, hymns, and unquestioned dogma. It wasn't reason that drove those regimes. It was the same faith-based impulse, certainty without evidence. That's why secular societies consistently do better. Countries like Sweden and Denmark, where most people reject religion, rank among the highest in peace, equality, and life expectancy. They prove morality comes from human choice and reason, not commandments from above. And that's Hitchens's challenge. Belief without evidence is dangerous, whether it's in a church or a dictatorship. What keeps civilization alive isn't faith. It's skepticism, open debate, and the willingness to change our minds when the facts demand it. So let me leave you with this. Would the world be safer if we replace dogma with reason? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this helpful, hit like, subscribe, and the bell so we can keep this conversation going.
Now, it's not part of my case, and I'm sure it's not part of Professor Grayling's or Professor Dawkins's either, to say that religion is the reason for all of this, or the exclusive or sole reason for all of it. I think it would be crude and reductionist to say that. But who is going to argue, I'll be fascinated to see, who is going to argue that the matter of faith, that the religious allegiance, that the preachings of religion have not in all these cases gravely exacerbated, gravely deepened, gravely poisoned and prolonged all of these things that have made our tenuous civilization extremely difficult to defend, uphold, maintain, let alone to advance. I don't believe this case could be made. That's for a simple reason, because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made, and it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Well, why do we deceive ourselves on this point? And is there anywhere, I'm now going to wind up, is there anywhere of the places I've mentioned, and I exempt Basra and all the other B's I could take you around, where it wouldn't be enormously welcome if there was a mass conversion to secularism, or a mass adoption of the secular idea and principle, of the principles of Bertrand Russell, who once spoke famously from this platform, of Thomas Paine, of Thomas Jefferson, of Voltaire, and others. And I'll close by saying that I want you to be on your guard against two false issues in this respect, and I'll be very brief. When I mentioned those gentlemen, and I could mention some ladies too in this connection, like Mary Wollstonecraft, don't let anyone tell you that, oh well, secular tyranny is just as bad. After all, there have been fascist and communist dictatorships which have been just as revolting. Fascism, as you know, was supported by the Catholic Church all through its life, and in fact till after it had died, and still is defended by it. One of the leaders of the Axis was actually, the Japanese leader, was actually a god. There's no way of saying fascism and National Socialism in the Axis was secular. And in the case of Stalinism and Maoism and the Khmer Rouge, the same mistake is made, and a religion is made out of man. It's the religious impulse itself that I think we need to oppose, to criticize in ourselves as well as in others. The argument from faith, in other words, the argument from certainty. So those of us who maintain this may not be described, my closing point, as fundamentalists or secularists, as certain cheap and demagogic and opportunist forces have recently been suggesting. We do believe in evidence, we do believe in skepticism, we do believe in reason. We hold our views with as much conviction and principle as any God-botherer does. But we are open to the argument, and we're going to prove it tonight to you. And don't let anyone dare to imply there's a moral equivalence between us and the fanatics and the fools and those who think they know God's will and can tell you what it is, who are our enemies, and your enemies too. So, I beg to propose the motion that stands in our name. Thank you.
In Belfast, Catholics and Protestants spent decades killing each other over their version of Christianity. More than 3,500 people died during the Troubles, many of them civilians, with religion as the dividing line. The Bible itself has fueled division. Jesus says in Matthew 10:34, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." That verse has been used for centuries to justify violence. Science also shows belief does not guarantee morality. Studies by Phil Zuckerman and others on secular countries like Sweden and Denmark reveal that societies with the lowest levels of religious belief actually rank highest in safety, equality, and quality of life. In contrast, highly religious regions often face higher crime and instability. And it is not just history. In modern times, we still see how religion fuels danger. In 2020, a Pew study found that government restrictions and social hostilities around religion reached the highest level in over a decade. From extremist groups in the Middle East to Christian nationalists storming the U.S. Capitol, prayer meetings have not been a symbol of safety. They've often been the starting point for violence.